Okay. Oh, hey, Mary Lily. Mary Lily identified herself as an interloper.
Yeah, I live in St. Paul. I was
Okay,
forwarded this notice from a friend who was, I think, involved with the league.
Well, good. Are you interested in water issues, and that's why you're interested here?
Yeah, I sit on the Community Advisory Committee of the Capital Region Watershed District.
Okay, well, good. Yeah, Jason's an exciting speaker, and I'm looking forward to his talk. And Peggy Quam just joined us, who is from League of Women Voters MEF, which is Minnetonka, Eden Prairie, Hopkins. So not meth, MEF.
That's my neighborhood.
Okay, so why don't we get started? I've started the recording here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to post this on our website. We will have more people joining us, I'm sure. And I see some are already online in other ways. So, hello, I'm Gretchen Sable, and I am Communications Director for League of Women Voters Upper Mississippi River Region. League of Women Voters Upper Mississippi River Region is a ILO.
Yes, okay.
We are an ILO, and that means we're an interleague organization. The members of our organization are other leagues of women voters. And so we have 61 as of today member leagues that are part of our group, and more people are sending in their dues as we speak because it's dues season. We have about 7,000 individuals in those leagues. And so in the 4 states, we have a lot of people. As you know, League of Women Voters people are very active and engaged, and will be good leaders as we work on different advocacy issues. What we do is we try to learn about issues, and then we advocate for things that fix whatever the problems might be. Today with us, we have Jason Moeckel. So now I've known Jason for a while here. Jason and I worked together when I was with the Pollution Control Agency, and he was with the DNR. And he's still with the DNR, and now I'm with League of Women Voters. So I've got the better end of the stick. Jason's going to talk about, Jason's the manager of the Inventory Monitoring and Analysis section at the DNR. And he's in charge of looking at the data and then figuring out what needs to be done to balance the needs of water extraction plus environmental services plus all the things that water is used for. So I think with that, Jason's joining us from his home in Minnetonka. Is that right?
Yep.
Yep. So is that Lake Minnetonka behind you there?
Well, it's not a live shot, but it is Lake Minnetonka. It was a couple of falls ago, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll see you later. Yeah.
I'll turn it over to Jason and he can roll on. If we could all mute ourselves except Jason, that would be wonderful. I don't know who's still making noise there. There we go.
Pillars of Prospect Park, I think was the...
Yeah, the Prospect Park person.
Okay, I'm going to share screen, and I hope I get the right one. Let's do it that way. Hopefully you're seeing that full size.
Yes, good job.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for having me, and it's great to see the turnout here with all the faces and names and wonderful diversity of geography. And I just realized I'm so often only talking to Minnesotans that I don't have maps of some of the places in here to orient you, but I'll try to describe it to the best of my ability. So I'm going to share just kind of an overview of what I've put together. I'm perfectly happy to have you ask questions. What I really
Okay, I'll put
for people to understand
Who's
the information that I'm presenting. And
Jason, hold on a second. We're going to find this person that's talking and get them to talk. I am not seeing the pillars of whatever that was.
I think that one might be gone. It looks like Sue Wilson's is unmuted.
Oh,
Sue Wilson, can you mute
Yes.
yourself?
There
And
you go.
Nancy
Thank
Hill
you.
too. Okay. Thank you, guys. Okay, Jason, go.
All right. So I have to kind of start with the boring stuff, but in reality, it's the stuff that I think you all are interested in because you're talking about trying to craft some policies, some directions, some stuff at the DC level. So I'm gonna set the backdrop. You're gonna get a really quick version of what state policy is in Minnesota, which is the basis for what we do and for what my section does. I'm going to talk about our approach to applying that state policy. And it really comes down to vigorously pursuing the science, but also building relationships with the stakeholders who are affected by the decisions that we are tasked with making. And then to illustrate that, I think it's really important to understand some of the technical detail. I'm not going to try to make hydrologists and hydrogeologists and fisheries biologists or modelers out of you folks. But I think as you try to think about policies that might work for a region, being able to tie that back to, well, what does it take to implement a policy like that? What does that look like is really important. So that's what I'm hoping that we're able to do. And I'm going to illustrate this with a particular geography in Minnesota. It's called Little Rock Creek. It's a small little trout stream on a tributary to the Mississippi River, right in the center of the state, about maybe 20 or 30 minutes kind of north and slightly west of St. Cloud, Minnesota, in some very sandy soils. And you'll understand why all of that's important as we get into it. So the first thing, though, I want to start with is the responsibility that my agency has under Minnesota statute, and this is just some of them, but these are kind of the biggies, is we are supposed to assure the supply. I call this the have your cake and eat it too statute, because we're supposed to develop and manage water resources to assure an adequate supply to meet long-range seasonal requirements for domestic, municipal, industrial, agriculture, fish and wildlife, recreation, power, navigation, and quality control purposes of the waters of the state. So imagine, right, if you have competing uses for a limited supply, you have to figure out how to apportion those uses. That's one way to think about it. And so we set the limits for what a water user can appropriate. If it's over 1 million gallons a year, you have to get a permit from the DNR. And we have to determine whether or not your application meets the requirements. And essentially those requirements, or what it requires of us, is to technically evaluate what we know about the current and projected water levels. What's the water quality? Will that use still protect ecosystems? And would that use still make sure that there's water available for future generations to meet their needs? Now, I'm not going to give you a geology of 101 of Minnesota, but I can tell you the geology is very different across this state, north to south, east to west. The abundance of groundwater is very different in this state, north to south and east to west. Some of our groundwater is tens of thousands of years old, and some of the water we're using will have literally only fallen on the land just in the last week to 10 days. It's highly variable around the state. So that really drives our need for lots of localized information. As part of our Minnesota rules, defining the way that we apply these statutes, and a really important rule points to, if there is that a direct relationship of a ground and water exists.
I have to
I think maybe we have another.
activate my sound.
Hey, guys, let's please mute. There we go.
If a surface water, let's just say a lake, a stream, or a wetland, is connected to its local aquifer, then and we know it, then we have to make sure that the use of that aquifer is not going to have an adverse impact on the surface water. And the way that we can do that is to set certain levels of protection elevation for the water or protected flow streams. Okay, we're almost done with sort of the boring slides, but the one last one that I want to set the stage here. So a lot of this stuff can seem like the black box. All this stuff that goes on is all inside this black box, and then DNR just makes the decision. And that's what people who get permits from us think it feels like, right? So part of what we're doing when we engage with our stakeholders is to try to explain, well, what's all in that black box? Well, frankly, there's a lot of analysis. There is a lot of math involved when you're doing water budget work. We have to look at drawdown estimates. So if you pump water here, what's it going to do over there at some distance? How is it going to affect other users? We have to determine whether or not pumping water out of the ground here is going to cause less flow or less water in a lake, stream, or wetland nearby. Sometimes it doesn't have to be very nearby either. It can be pretty far away, miles in several cases. But what we really rely on a lot are groundwater models. These are technical tools that ingest all this data about all these things, and then we can set specific parameters of things that we're looking for and to determine whether or not it's going to happen or isn't going to happen. Things like stream flow or water levels in a private domestic well. Will there still be water available in that well or in a municipal well or some other nearby user? And in most cases, the way we historically have looked at this is almost always the belief was we're below the threshold. It was okay. We could protect the flows, we could protect elevations, we could protect safe yield, and we could protect other people's water supply. And so we can issue those permits. But then you have to continue to gather data because things aren't always static. New uses come in, things in the neighborhood change. People ask for more water, people ask for less water. So you have to keep track. So we keep doing this sort of iterative process of gathering more data and going back to the black box, doing the analysis, because everything we concluded before still makes sense. And that's really the way that Minnesota operated for a very long time. The trouble is, we didn't have a lot of data to put into the black box. Quite often we were doing our best guess, our best calculation, or we did it with the limited data that we had. And it wasn't until a problem would develop that we would find out, oh, there's a problem. So in reality, we're in this world of, we had insufficient hydrologic data, and that's still the case in places. And there we can issue a conditional permit. We can say, well, you can have this water for now, but we're not sure. We're going to need to keep checking. So stand by. Or we can just say, nope, we don't know enough and we're not going to issue the permit. Sometimes that happens. More often than not, lately, what we've said is we need to be cautious. We'll issue conditional. We'll put 3 years, 5 years on it, and then we're going to recheck and to see if it still makes sense. Gather the data, go back to the black box, do the analysis. What we are learning in some places in the state of Minnesota is that we're actually up here in this other option 3, which is the amount of water that we've authorized to be used is above a threshold. And you can just think of that as something that we don't want to be above. Like we're using too much. We've determined that it's creating some problems. It could be water levels in White Bear Lake. It could be stream flows in Little Rock Creek. It could be interferences in somebody else's wells, that sort of thing. Okay, so in that case, Minnesota rules delineate how you resolve the conflict. And I'm not going to get deep into a lot of that today. It gets into priorities and what's a higher priority use and so on and so forth. That could be a whole talk in amongst itself. But the point really is that when you have certain policies out there, you need the data in order to evaluate whether or not you're achieving that policy objective. And what we've been on is this very deliberate process of enhancing the amount of data we have to be able to answer these kinds of questions by doing what I'm describing. What's in the black box, we try not to make it be a black box. Okay, so that's sort of the framework for about how we go about doing this work. And now I'm going to illustrate this with a few, and I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. I often describe groundwater as calculating the invisible because you can't really see it. The only way you can see it is to put a pipe in the ground, drill a hole, put a pipe in the ground, and to measure it. So we're growing our network, trying to get lots and lots of measurements. We've gone from 500 or 600 monitoring wells to over 1,200 now, just in the last 10 years. We do a lot of statistical calculations, and we use a lot of models. Some of these are really simple models. Pump here, draw down over there. Is that well going to be okay? Yes or no? If it's yes, okay, we can issue the permit if that was the only issue of concern. but oftentimes they're very complex. And that's the example I'm going to illustrate tonight. So what I'm telling you is that we have to calculate this thing underground that we can't see, but this is cone of depression. When you pump water out of the ground in a pipe, you pull water into that pipe and it creates this cone that you can see illustrated here. And everything that we're trying to do is figure out what's happening to that, for example, wetland or that domestic well, or let's say there's a stream nearby, or let's say there's a chemical plume nearby. Well, we don't want to move it. We don't want to impact somebody else's well. So those are all the kinds of things that we have to consider. And really, when you look at aquifers in nature, they're very complicated. This illustrates a very simple example of a water table aquifer, a confining layer that water doesn't move through very fast, and then another aquifer underneath that in yellow. Well, in reality, oftentimes we have many, many, many of these, and we have wells in many of these different aquifers, and they're all interacting in very complicated ways. So it's like putting numbers on every one of those little arrows and saying, okay, here's a water particle and I'm tracking it through the system. And what you really want to know is what happened over here, or what happened to this well when that one turned on, or that one turned on. Okay, hopefully this is all making some sense. So it really comes back to the thing that we all learned in high school or college, which is there's this thing called a water cycle, a hydrologic cycle. We get rain, we get evaporation, we get infiltration, we get recharge, we get water moving to a lake, we get water flowing in a river. What our modeling has to do is account for all of it. So it's a very complicated series of bank accounts, and we're trying to keep track of all of it and figure out, is somebody going to cause an overdraft? It's the simplest analogy I can come up with. We use a lot of complex geologic mapping to do this. So we have a geologic atlas program that's going around the state that's mapping all the different layers of geology and the materials and their parameters, their characteristics, how water moves through them when you pump them. And when you do that in a particular geography like this, okay, so this is Little Rock Creek. This is a map that just shows the area of interest that we wanted to make sure we were looking at. So we developed this groundwater model for an area that's larger than the creek itself, and larger than even its surface watershed. And you can see all these different numbers and symbols. Those represent some monitoring stations that we're using, some long-term data. That's not all of the data, because if I put all of it on here, it gets to be too messy, but these just represent some of them. And there are these stations that are scattered throughout the watershed. If you were to look at this area from satellite view or from a photographic image, here you can see, for example, a blue line that's running kind of crossways through this photo. And you can see some of these numbers. Those represent monitoring wells, then a stream flow gauge. And you can see these green odd-shaped circles. These are irrigation systems and pivots. And so the fundamental question that we were challenging ourselves to ask here is the pumping of groundwater near Little Rock Creek affecting the flows of Little Rock Creek? And what we zeroed in on is that it's not, the pumping of groundwater doesn't, there's not enough pumped to affect high flows in the creek. The sort of stuff that's happening during snow melt and spring rains. There's way more water moving through that system than you could even measure accurately compared to the amount of irrigation that would be used. And I'm going to cut to the chase. What we focused on is, and we believe this to be true for many Minnesota river systems, is August median base flows. It's a low flow time of year for Minnesota typically. It's a biologically important month, and I'll come back to it. But we've tied all this to some ecological criteria to help us understand ecosystem impact. So this is the setting that we're working in. This is what one of these monitoring systems look like. So this is the water table. There's one in the water table and one in the deeper aquifer. And then we've got these flow measuring and monitoring devices on the riverbank. This is one of our staff getting a flow at slightly higher flow than you can't safely wade in the river at this time. So it's using a flow tracker device across the river. And what we historically would work with oftentimes is these monthly measurements of water levels in a well, which is interesting, right? It tells us that the yellow dots are sort of fluctuating over the course of what is 2 years, 3 years here, sort of fluctuating in this area that's about 2 or 3 feet. kind of up and down within 2 or 3 feet. And the black dots are showing a well nearby that's fluctuating more than that. It's going from 1,048 feet all the way up to 1,052 feet, let's say. So that's what that shows us. But modern technology actually gives us even better data. This is the same monitoring well, but what it's showing is what we get with data loggers. These are recording the water levels hourly. But you can see how much more information is filled in. What a different picture that we get with this kind of data. Now, we don't have this on all of our monitoring wells across the state. And we only have it for about the last 10 years in quite a few, and even in fewer still the last 5 years, because this equipment just wasn't readily available. But this is what our network is beginning to look like all across the state. So don't glaze over. I just wanted to show you, this is sort of the complexity of the bank accounts. So the blue line is tracking one account. The orange line is tracking another one. The purple another, and the green, which is the precip here. And so it's all about reconciling how these accounts interact. And when you draw from one, how fast does it matriculate in the other? And what's the response you get over here and you get over there? That's why we need groundwater models to do this. You can't just look at this with your eyes and to quantify the effect. You can see an effect, but you can't really quantify it with just your eyes. Okay, so again, just another illustration of Little Rock Creek, some monitoring data, some monitoring wells, some irrigation systems, so that we can quantify those kind of interactions, those dynamics that you can see illustrated in this graph. This is another example of some water data. This is the blue represents the water table. That's the shallowest aquifer. The orange represents the buried aquifer. So that one's below a clay layer. And that's where the majority of the pumping is happening in this particular aquifer. And you can see that reflected with all the ups and downs on the orange line. What you can also see is that every year it kind of rebounds more or less to the same level. Some years it rebounds a little higher. Some years it's not as high. But in fact, if you look at this one from May of 2012 through October of 17, the net overall gain, it's gaining a little bit. It's actually higher. Okay, well, so what's going on out there? Well, I can tell you it was also a pretty wet time of year, or a wet period of time in Minnesota. Okay, so you're getting the idea of the kinds of things that we consider. So we talk about ecosystem thresholds. And we dug deep into a lot of ecological literature that's been developed over the last decades about how much change can you impose on a system, hydrologic change on a system, before you expect the ecosystem to no longer be able to sustain itself in the same way. And what a lot of that literature says basically is that, you know, anything less than 10% change in the hydrology really have a hard time actually detecting any change out there in the ecosystem. There's enough natural variation in the ecological systems, it'd be really hard to detect. It might be happening, but it'd be really hard to know. We just don't have the instruments to do it. And it's also clear that when you get over 20%, if you start taking out 20% of a flow in a river on a regular basis, it's very likely that some species are not just going to do as well as they did before. So that was the theory that we were working with. And then we needed to apply not only to Minnesota, but to Little Rock Creek. So we looked at all of our data, and this is a very rich database, tens of thousands of observations of fish species in Minnesota and stream flow data. And one of the things that this is showing us is that the more flow there is in August, the more median discharge, the more species we see represented. Now that can be just as simple as saying going from a small creek to a big river, you would expect more species, true? But still, when you compare August to other months, August shows up as a good indicator. It's a good index flow for us to use. That's the point of this graph. And again, we're not talking about the runoff. We're not talking about what's happening in melts and rainfalls. We're talking about that invisible stuff that's kind of seeping in from the stream, from the bank and the river bottom, that base flow component. So what we did for Little Rock Creek is we went out and took thousands of measurements of the habitat in the stream. That's what that looks like. And then we layered in the flows that were happening in the stream over this period of study that we had. And then we used our groundwater model to tell us, well, if there hadn't been pumping, what would the flow have been? Okay, so that's the green line. Without pumping, this is the flow in Little Rock Creek. The blue line is with pumping. And what we can see is that there's significant differences that show up in 4 of the 12 years. Some of those are dry years, drier than normal years, but some of those were actually normal years. And not to get deep into the science, I'm just trying to build the case for you of what it is that we had to work our way through. So we went through all these different life stages of fish. So that's young fish to juvenile fish to adult fish that are spawning. And we know what kind of habitats they're using based on their size and the species. And then we determined how they were affected, or their habitats were affected by this reduction in flow. And what we've determined for Little Rock Creek is that in 4 out of 12 years, 2 of these species lost more than 20% of their habitat, an average decrease of 28 to 27%. And we believe that's an adverse impact. There was other species that were affected, but not as much and not as often as these couple of species, which in this case was brown trout juveniles and Johnny darters. I didn't want to get deep into that's what the lettering that you see there for the species life stage, but just to explain the concept. So what we are doing is to continue analyzing the water data. That's that water budget, those bank accounts. And now we're working with the permittees in the Little Rock Creek area to say, here, we have this problem. We have authorized too much water to be used. We've determined here's how much of a change we're going to need to achieve to get us back on the safe side of that threshold. So our objective for Little Rock Creek is to get to 15% or less based on our habitat analysis. And really what we're trying to do is now get ahead of these issues in other parts of the state. In Little Rock Creek, we're reactive, right? Permits were issued a long time ago. Information starts to accumulate. It looks like, oh, we've crossed the threshold. We're going to have to revisit this. That's really hard to do because people have developed plans and they're doing their livelihood based on authorized volumes of water. And now we're saying, oh, we got to revisit it. Ideally, the way you do this is the code account that we might be getting close to thresholds. There's other parts of the state where there are signals that some of these problems are developing. And so we've intensified our monitoring networks in those to make sure the recording seems to be going. I think we're okay now. So other places in the state where we're trying to get this kind of data to be able to be this vigorous with the science and also then engage the stakeholders in to either is this a solve this by conservation, meaning small amount of change solves the problem, or bigger change, okay, maybe conservation is not going to be enough. What else needs to be on the table? What are the other options? Those are the things that we're pursuing. And, you know, Gretchen's heard me say this, I think others have as well. You know, for Minnesota, we're really in, I think, the urgency room. So, and let me put this into context. I get news articles sent to me by people concerned about what they're reading in California, or there was one today about Oregon and growing alfalfa that was being shipped across the ocean because of the quality of that alfalfa, but what it was doing to some nearby wetlands and the wildlife, or Arizona or other states where they're dealing with severe scarcity of water. Minnesota, I think, is in, and I think the upper Midwest in many cases, not everywhere, and I'm going to be very careful to qualify all of this, but I think we're largely dealing with water abundance, but just not necessarily always the amount that we need in some of the places where we are already committed to using it, or where there's a lot of infrastructure to continue to want to grow for other reasons. And so that might mean shifting the way we source our water, which that all has complications, but I think that for the most part, those communities and those states that are experiencing those real scarcity problems would love to have our urgency room problems. And I think we have really strong statutes and really strong rules. We can get into some of the other things. I know Gretchen has brought up some of the water train, and I'll take some questions here and we can have a discussion. But I think you also can appreciate that trying to apply those statutes and rules requires a lot of data. The work that I showed you for Little Rock Creek was years in the making. Lots of technical resources, even just to go out and get that fish information on Little Rock Creek specifically. I don't think that we're going to be able to replicate that kind of intense, technically sound data collection everywhere in the state where we start to run up to these kind of problems. We're going to have to figure out other ways to say, okay, here's our threshold. But I think early on, what we're finding is that when we're bumping up against these thresholds, there's a lot of disbelief. You know, there's a lot of resistance. And I think we're going to have to hit some of these and break through that resistance and that disbelief to then get to the place where we can say, yep, we experienced this over here. And based on these principles, we think this is the limit here as well. Some transfer, if you will. All right, I think that was the last of my it was. Now I do have a few White Bear Lake slides in here if there's folks that are interested, but I'd really like to just pause and see what kind of questions or what direction as a group you'd like to go with this.
Okay, so we got some questions. I asked people to put their questions into the chat, and then what I'll
I
do is
can't see any of that.
Yeah, so I'll call on the people in the order that their questions appear, and they can ask their question. And the first one was from Mary Lily. And of course, there we go. Mary Lily, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Chris, now I can't find it. Okay. Minnesota, wait, that's somebody else's.
I found
Oh, here we are.
So it's about the water train.
Yeah. Yeah.
How is DNR thinking about the water train out of Oregon? So what the water train is a concept that somebody will send a train full of tank cars to a place that has a lot of water and take it to a place that needs water and sell it. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jason.
So
It's more than an idea. They're doing it.
There was a very specific proposal that showed up a few years ago now that came to the DNR. And we have a thing in Minnesota that's called a preliminary well assessment. So before you drill a high capacity well, you submit this application to us basically. And what we will do is a desktop exercise that says, here's everything we know about that geography and that geology and maybe the other users around it. And we see either no concerns that are obvious, or we see a few things that you should know about, sort of buyer beware, or we see major red flags. You can expect this to be a very challenging application to go through because we're going to have this, and this, right? In the case of the water train, what they were proposing to do was literally prohibited by existing statute. They wanted to pump from our deepest, highest quality, in some respects, highest quality aquifer, the Mount Simon. And they were not proposing necessarily to use it for local domestic needs. So it was very, frankly, straightforward for us to say, this is going to be an issue. We don't believe we could even issue a permit to do this. But it got a lot of people's attention, and it got the legislature's attention because they were concerned that that was because of the specific proposal. But what if somebody came back with a different proposal that didn't necessarily trip that same trigger and was within the confines of statute? So the legislature developed some language. We worked with the legislature and we put some language forward. And there was some modifications to statutes that extended those protections to the Mount Simon beyond just the immediate metropolitan counties, so that we could get better protection for that aquifer instead of just going across the county line and saying, oh, it's different over here, because Groundwater doesn't follow county lines. Our primary responsibility is to ensure the current and future use of water in the state of Minnesota. So we have to take the statutes that we have and then evaluate requests, permit applications, as to whether or not they're consistent. That particular proposal raised a lot of eyebrows and a lot of concerns. So I think in terms of what your question is, what are we thinking about it? We're thinking we have really strong statutes and rules, but we're also open to saying, does the state of Minnesota need to do something different? There were some tweaks made last year, and there are actually some proposals this year, I think, that would go even a little bit further into what kinds of things would be considered, including some public meetings.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Mary Ellen Miller is our next question. Mary Ellen, do you want to ask your question? And we'll hold off on White Bear until after these other questions, okay? So do your first question, Mary Ellen.
I hope I can remember it.
I can read it for you.
Yeah, why don't
Minnesota
you?
is a perfect water quality quantity study site with all the lakes that reflect in full view what's happening above and below ground, the impacts of climate change and water use patterns. What moving forward would help to gain great public support for these kinds of studies?
It's a great question. You know, we've been trying to wake up Minnesota residents to the notion that despite our abundance of water and despite the abundance of really high quality water in some parts of the state, we are at risk of overusing water and contaminating. The fact of the matter is, it's not that we're at risk of contaminating, we already have, right? I mean, we have numerous examples of contaminated water in the state of Minnesota. Water that's not fit to be used for its intended purpose without treatment. But we think that many Minnesotans have taken some of those things for granted, in particular the quantity, the abundance. But I personally think we've seen a major change. And there's a few things that tell me that. 10 years ago, when you looked at water use data in the state of Minnesota, it was climbing 3 billion gallons a year on average. For the last 10 years, it's been going down. Even though we've authorized more users and we have more people, the total amount of water being used is going down. And it's largely happening in municipalities, and it's happening with residential use of water. Now, some of that can be attributed to more efficient appliances. In fact, I think quite a bit of it can be. Washing machines and dishwashers and toilets, just use the new ones, all use a lot less water than they used to. They're advertised that way all the time. Just the other night, I was flipping through on the news and I saw an advertisement for the dishwasher soap that said, you'll use less water if you use our product. So they're obviously appealing to something that people care about. And I think we're seeing more and more of that and hearing more and more. You know, I think we have to continue to inform people, but I also want us to be mindful that we can't raise alarms unnecessarily, you know, and that's why I've used this term, the urgency room, rather than the emergency room. You know, even last year, during the most significant drought that we had, we really weathered the storm pretty well. There were some problems, and some of our water users in northern Minnesota in particular had to stop using water because their source was a small stream or a river, and it was for irrigation or for gravel washing and that sort of thing, dust control. Nobody's domestic water supply was in jeopardy last year during the drought. If that happened year after year after year after year, like what we experienced last year, I think we'd be having some different issues. Groundwater is very resilient in the state of Minnesota. We're evaluating water level trends all across the state. And there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, water levels are holding steady. And in those exception areas, those small geographic areas, we're working very diligently to try to figure out how much we can use sustainably. So you want to hold on White Bear Lake. Sorry, I tend to give long answers to questions.
No, I
That's okay.
really appreciated that. That was a wonderful answer.
Catherine Franzik from Wheaton, Illinois. I'm going to give a little bit of background on this, Catherine, and then I'll let you talk. So cities around Lake Michigan, there's a thing called the Great Lakes Compact, and that says that they will not allow water, all the states and provinces that border the Great Lakes will not allow water to be diverted out of the watershed. And so cities that are in the watershed are allowed to use water from Lake Michigan for their supply. But if you're outside Lake Michigan, you're not covered. And so I don't know exactly where Wheaton is. I don't know if you're part of the Chicago exception. So anyhow, that's just kind of a piece of background there. Catherine's question, do you want to ask your question, Catherine?
Sure. Thanks, Gretchen, for the background too. I want to learn more as much as I can, but in DuPage County, we're a western suburb of Chicago. We get our water source from Lake Michigan. And my question is this sustainable? And then a tag on to that is Lake Superior water being used for homes diverting to homeowners for their water? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll answer the last one first. There are municipal water supplies, Duluth, for example, and others along the shore that do use Lake Michigan. Or excuse me, that'd be amazing. Lake Superior water. I think that might, if it was Michigan, it might create some water battle. So yes, there are some communities along the North Shore of Lake Superior that rely on it. They really have no other options. Groundwater along the North Shore is really, really hit and miss, and oftentimes not really good quality. Typically, it's fine for private domestic wells, but it just can't support, a larger community use. The question about Lake Michigan in terms of sustainability, I dare not wander beyond the data that I know. I know just enough about long-term trends of groundwater in the Chicago area that, and it's a little vague in my memory because it's been a few years, but I think that in the Chicago area, they had to go away from groundwater because it was trending downward for a very long time. And I think the concern was that was not sustainable. In terms of Lake Michigan, I would imagine the majority of that water gets ultimately treated and put back to the lake. And so some of it's being consumed and it evaporates and it goes, to the atmosphere and so forth. But like here in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, our big cities rely on the river. But that water goes into homes, it goes into the pipes, and it gets treated, and then it comes back into the river again. Groundwater doesn't do that. Here, when you pump groundwater, you put it through your homes, you use it once, and then you send it down to the treatment plant, and they put it in the river. So it doesn't go back into the aquifer. And that's part of the challenge is that, when you're pulling it out of the groundwater faster than it's being replenished at a local geographic area, you can have these impacts like I described for Little Rock Creek or Lakeland.
Yeah, so I just want to add a little more for the benefit of our friends in Illinois. Chicago has kind of a different deal. They draw their drinking water from Lake Michigan, and then they discharge it to the Illinois River, the Chicago River that goes to the Illinois River. And so it's an interbasin transfer. They're taking it from Lake Michigan, sending it into the Mississippi watershed. So that's why we have so many leagues in the Chicago area that are members of the Upper Mississippi, because they have that artificial link to the Mississippi. So when you look at the blog post where you all got the link to join this meeting, I do have a news article in there about Joliet. Joliet's groundwater supply has run out, and they are looking to connect to the Lake Michigan system too. So I think that the continuing trend in groundwater is down there, and it's something that is a big concern. So,
As an aside, just real quick, I've always had a concern about groundwater levels here in the western suburbs, but anytime I've asked a question of some experts and about our aquifer quality, I don't get any answers.
Well, I think the Illinois, I'm trying to remember, is it the Illinois Natural something survey? They do
Geologic survey, maybe.
Yeah, it's been a few years, but I know that they have a fairly, I'm familiar with some of the monitoring wells that they have, and I don't know if that's publicly accessible. Here in Minnesota, any of our monitoring well data is accessible through our website. Not that that's an easy thing to do, and I'm not sure if Illinois has that, but
But that would be a good thing for us to do a program on. I would love to look at the water issues in Chicago and to look at how kind of the system works in such a different way than what we're used to in the rest of the state, the rest of the watershed. I was the next question here. And what it was, so I've been following this water diversion issue some, and there's a lot of concern about Nestle in Michigan. Nestle has a big bottled water plant there. And so I was wondering how no diversion out of the watershed happens for things where water leaves in other forms. So breweries, you know, a big brewery sends a lot of water out. An ethanol plant uses a lot of water and that gets shipped away. Bottled water uses a lot. How do you deal with those things?
so the distinction in Minnesota law is, and this was the water train as well, what they wanted to do was a bulk transfer of raw water. So they weren't doing anything to that water that, you know, they weren't putting any coloring in it. They weren't putting any alcohol in it. They weren't putting any sugars in it. You know, these things that, as the examples that you provided, other than bottled water, which I guess there's still, in that case, you'd be filtering that water and then bottling it. Those are not prohibited, but a bulk transfer is prohibited. So, and I have to go back to the statute, but I think it's 50 miles. So here's an example of a situation that we have to be mindful of. In southwestern Minnesota, we do not have very prolific groundwater aquifers. So depending on which county you're in, you know, your city just may not be able to have water right there. But not too far away, maybe within 30 miles, there are some aquifers and they're capable of producing some water. And so we have these things called rural water districts. They establish a geographic area, they establish some well fields, they pump those wells to a distribution system that reaches across several counties. Sort of like a, you know, if you're a large municipality, but in this case, you're talking about across multiple counties rather than just within a municipal system. But they don't really have any other good options. And we're managing it within the limits of sustainable use. In fact, they need more water. And so we're relying on water coming out of underneath the Missouri River through the Lewis and Clark project across the state of South Dakota to come into southwestern Minnesota to bring water in to meet some of our water needs. In some cases, the water's there, but it's just really not good quality. Natural contaminants, metals, things that are not good, and you don't want to feed your livestock because it makes them sick. So, you know, when I look at these things,
Yeah.
I think there's always a question of balance. Like, is it necessarily bad to transfer water from one place to another? Well, I don't think it is just outright bad. Like, there's trade-offs, right? So what are the trade-offs? And I think that the challenge is to get all those trade-offs on the ledger so that you can make an informed decision. And that's what I think this Little Rock Creek project that I tried to illustrate for all of you shows is, what are the trade-offs of using water for a productive agricultural community that is a vital part of that local economy that supports the school district, supports the local tax base, right? Okay, so the water that goes into those potatoes or those kidney beans or that corn or the soybeans in some cases, a lot of times that irrigation in Minnesota goes for a lot of specialty crops, things that humans consume. Not all, but a lot. So when that water leaves, you know, rice and it goes in those products somewhere else, is that an export? It's not an export of a raw material, and it's permissible under Minnesota statute.
Okay, thanks. Does
To
there,
develop and use the water.
is there any other questions for Jason tonight? If not, we'll go back to Maryland's question about White Bear Lake. So White Bear Lake, do you want to talk a little bit about that without, you don't have to go through all the legal stuff, but
Right.
Yeah, I'll
Well,
just,
my question about White Bear was, first of all, I'm a sailor. And even though I live in Iowa, I've sailed a lot of lakes in Minnesota. And I have a lot of friends who live around White Bear, and I don't understand it, but what they've been experiencing is a diminution of water in the lake, right? And I don't know, is that climate change? Is that groundwater? Is it just a shallow lake to start with?
I can answer those questions. I think you're still seeing my PowerPoint, are you not? Or am I not?
no, you need to reshare. I turned off the sharing. I'll fix that.
Okay, I'll, oh, yeah, it says it was disabled.
Yeah, I know. I thought it'd be nice for everybody to see their faces. Okay, try now.
All right. So I put up a graph here. So this is White Bear Lake in January of 2002.
Are we see, is anybody else seeing it yet?
We haven't seen his, he has to share it again.
Yeah,
We'll
reshare it.
Share.
Something happened.
Oh, it's probably me.
Try
There
it
you go.
again.
There we
Got
go.
it? You see it?
Yep.
Yeah, see it now.
Okay. So we have January 2002 through January of 2018. And these lines represent different water levels. And I've already told you about groundwater modeling. The blue line represents the water level that we saw in White Bear Lake. Okay, that's what happened. That's what we measured out there. So it went down to basically 919, elevation of 919. The groundwater model says that if there was no pumping of groundwater within 5 miles of White Bear Lake, then we would expect the water levels in White Bear Lake to have been something like the green line. Okay. So the difference between lake levels from this part of the graph over here at 925, 926, and the low that the model says we would have seen is 923. So the model says we might have seen about 2 or 3 feet of fluctuation because of climate alone. But when you factor in the pumping, that caused another 4 feet of lake level drop. What we've determined though is that because the communities around the lake are actually using less water now than they were back in 1988, the 1990s, and the 2000s, the orange line is what we think would happen now under the existing use. So wouldn't go as low as it did, but it'd still go low. And we're under a court order that's directed us to implement certain things. And that's what we're working through right now. And essentially what it's saying is, in order to protect the recreational uses of White Bear Lake, we believe that we need to keep the lake, at or above about an elevation of 922, which is this gray line. So we were at the blue. Under today's use, we think we'd be at the orange, but that still doesn't get us to the gray. So we've got work to do. And that's what we're currently working on with all these communities and the legislature. That's the short and sweet story about, not so sweet, but the short story of White Bear Lake. Maybe I'll just say the implication is, in the court order, is that the communities that are within 5 miles, or if they're permitted use, if they've got a well within 5 miles, those are the ones that are affected by this court order. And so you can see how large an area that encompasses. And what we've most recently said is that in order to hit that 922 elevation, we're going to need water level usage in these municipalities to go from where it is. That's the blue bars on this graph. So somewhere north of about 90 gallons per capita per day. So 90 gallons per person in the community, down to 55. So to go from the blue down to this sort of red level. And that's basically limiting each of these municipalities to only the amount of water that people would use in their homes. And then you only get 55 gallons per person per day in the residential use. Obviously, that's huge impacts to all the other uses within a municipality. Hospitals, schools, hotels, restaurants, gas stations, anybody that uses water does not fall under domestic use. And so this is an area where we really need to find some alternatives so that we can better manage for the recreational uses in White Bear Lake, consistent with Minnesota statute. The Minnesota statute protects recreational uses. But this has been a long time in development. And this is 30 to 40. These are decisions that were made 40 and 50 years ago. Very difficult to undo those overnight.
So my question is, given your last response briefly, so is it totally population? Or is there any historical data that shows that White Bear has dropped to these levels before?
The historical record for White Bear Lake goes back to the early 1900s, and water levels during the Dust Bowl in particular were pretty low. They weren't as low as they got this time around, but they were low.
Okay.
But that was a much drier climate.
Mhm.
We're experiencing the 30 wettest years in the record of the state of Minnesota. We are in the 30 wettest years right now.
Despite the drought?
Yeah, well, one dry year in 30 doesn't
Right.
averages very much.
So this is population.
It is largely being driven by, and that was why that graph that I showed earlier, if there was no use of the groundwater, lake levels would be about where this green line is. That's our best estimate based on a very sophisticated groundwater model. In fact, what we experienced was the blue line. So we can figure out that while the lake fluctuated between 926 and 919, 4 feet of that is because of water use, 3 feet of that is climate driven.
This is very good data, Jason. Thank you so much for sharing this. This is
You're welcome.
really amazing, amazing data. I want to tell my White Bear friends about, you can see this impact.
We've published this. It's all of this is available on our website. We've published it in the White Bear, the local White Bear press as well. It gets a ton of coverage. And the other question you asked is White Bear Lake a shallow lake? No, it's a deep lake. And in fact, that's part of what makes it so unique in this part of the state. It is one of the deepest lakes, and that's why it's so connected to its groundwater.
Ah, okay.
But it's also why it's one of the gems that it is, because it's so connected to groundwater. It doesn't get a lot of runoff from the surface, and the groundwater tends to be a lot clearer and cleaner. And so it's a very deep, clear lake with a very diverse aquatic plant community and a very strong fishery. But it has a lot of shallow area on its near shore. So like you can go out 200 feet and the lake level you might only go from your knees to your thighs. And that's why it's really vulnerable. When the water levels drop just a few feet, a lot of lake bottom gets exposed. And that's very disruptive from the riparian use and recreational standpoint for the years that happens. Stimulates incredible aquatic plants though. I'll love it when the water levels go back up.
Okay, so I want to thank Jason. It's 8:05 and we're going to let him get on with his life. He just got back from Mexico last night. So thank you for being with us. And I'll put the recording and also the links that Jason sends us to this White Bear data on our website so we can cover that too. Thank you very much. And we'll see y'all. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hey,
Have a good evening.
developed a groundwater model for White Bear Lake.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, he's retired now. He retired a couple of years ago.
Now, for example,